Section 4 of The Adventures of Peter Cottontail by Thornton W. Burgess. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jude Summers. Section 4. Peter has another great laugh. Shadow the Weasel gets lost. And the plot of two scamps. Chapter 10. Peter has another great laugh. It was just past sunup as Reddy Fox started down the Lone Little Path to the Green Meadows. Reddy was late. He should be over at the Old Briar-patch by this time. He was afraid now that Peter Rabbit would not be there. When he came in sight of the Old Briar-patch, there sat Peter on the edge of it. "Good morning, Peter Rabbit," said Reddy Fox in his politest manner. "I am sorry to have kept you waiting. It is all because I had a terrible fright last night." "Is that so? What was it?" asked Peter, ducking down behind a big bramble bush to hide his smile. "Why, I went over to Farmer Brown's garden to see if that new planting of young cabbage was all right, and there I met a terrible monster. It frightened me so that I did not dare to come out this morning until jolly, round Mr. Sun had begun to climb up in the sky. And so I am a little late. Are you ready, Peter Rabbit, to go up to the new planting of young cabbage with me?" said Reddy in his pleasantest manner. Now, what do you think Peter Rabbit did? Why, Peter just began to laugh. He laughed and shouted. He lay down on his back and kicked his heels for very joy. But all the time he took care to keep behind a big friendly bramble bush. Reddy Fox stared at Peter Rabbit. He just didn't know what to make of it. He began to think that Peter had gone crazy. He couldn't see a thing to laugh at, yet here was Peter laughing fit to kill himself. Finally, Peter stopped and sat up. Did the monster catch you, Reddy Fox?" he asked, wiping his eyes. "No," replied Reddy. "It didn't catch me because I could run faster than it could, but it chased me all the way home." "In that case, I think I'll not go up to the cabbage bed this morning, for you know I cannot run as fast as you can, Reddy, and the monster might catch me," replied Peter very gravely. "Besides," he added, "I have had my fill of tender young cabbage, and it was very nice indeed." "What?" shouted Reddy Fox. "Yes," continued Peter Rabbit. "I just couldn't wait till morning, so I went up there early last night. I'm very much obliged to you for telling me of it, Reddy Fox. I am indeed." For just a little minute an ugly look crept into Reddy's face, for now he knew that once more Peter Rabbit had fooled him. But he kept his temper and managed to smile as he said, "Oh, don't mention it, Peter Rabbit. Don't mention it. But tell me, didn't you meet the monster?" "No," replied Peter Rabbit. And then, do what he couldn't keep sober another minute, but began to laugh just as he had before. "What's the joke, Peter Rabbit? Tell me so that I can laugh too," begged Reddy Fox. "Why," said Peter Rabbit when he could get his breath, "the joke is that the monster that frightened you so was the old straw hat of Farmer Brown's boy, and I was underneath it. Then Reddy Fox knew just how badly Peter Rabbit had fooled him. With a snarl, he sprang right over the bramble bush at Peter Rabbit. But Peter was watching and darted away along one of his own special little paths through the Old Briar-patch. Reddy tried to follow, but the brambles tore his clothes and scratched his face and stuck in his feet. Finally he had to give it up. Torn and bleeding and angry, he turned back home, and as he left the Old Briar-patch, he could still hear Peter Rabbit laughing. Chapter 11. Shadow the Weasel Gets Lost. All the Green Meadows had heard how Peter Rabbit had frightened Reddy Fox with an old straw hat, and everywhere that Reddy went, someone was sure to shout after him, "Reddy Fox is fine to see, he's as brave can be, till he meets an old straw hat, then he don't know where he's at." Then Reddy would lose his temper and chase his tormentors. Most of all, he wanted to catch Peter Rabbit. He lay in wait for Peter in fence corners and behind bushes and trees, but somehow Peter seemed always to know that Reddy was there. In the Old Briar-patch Peter was safe. Reddy had tried to follow him there, but he had found that it was no use at all. Peter's paths were so narrow, and the brambles tore Reddy's clothes and scratched him so that he had to give it up. Reddy was thinking of this one day as he sat on his doorstep scowling over at the Old Briar-patch, and then all of a sudden he thought of Shadow the Weasel. Shadow is so slim that he can go almost anywhere that anyone else can, and he is so fierce that nearly all of the little meadow people are terribly afraid of him. Reddy smiled. It was a mean, wicked, crafty smile. Then he hopped up and hurried to find Shadow the Weasel and tell him his plan. Shadow listened, and then he too began to smile. "It's easy, Reddy Fox, the easiest thing in the world. We'll get Peter Rabbit just as sure as fat hens are good eating," said he, as they started for the Old Briar-patch. Reddy's plan was very simple. Shadow the Weasel was to follow Peter Rabbit along Peter's narrow little paths and drive Peter out of the Old Briar-patch onto the Green Meadows, where Reddy Fox could surely catch him. So Reddy Fox sat down to wait while Shadow started into the Old Briar-patch. Peter Rabbit heard him coming, and of course Peter began to run. Now, when Peter first made his home in the Old Briar-patch, he had foreseen that some day Shadow the Weasel might come to hunt him there. So Peter had made dozens and dozens of little paths, twisting and turning and crossing and recrossing in the most puzzling way. Of course, Peter himself knew every twist and turn of every one of them, but Shadow had not gone very far before he was all mixed up. He kept his sharp little nose to the ground to smell Peter's footsteps, but Peter kept crossing his own tracks so often that pretty soon Shadow could not tell which path Peter had taken. Peter led him farther and farther into the middle of the Old Briar-patch. Right there, Shadow came to a great big puddle of water. Peter had jumped clear across it, for you know Peter's legs are long and meant for jumping. Now Shadow hates to get his feet wet, and when he reached the puddle, he stopped. He glared with fierce little red eyes across at Peter Rabbit, sitting on the other side. Then he started around the edge. Peter waited until Shadow was almost around, and then he jumped back across the puddle. There was nothing for Shadow to do but go back around, which he did. Of course, Peter just did the same thing over again, all the time laughing in his sleeve, for Shadow the Weasel was growing angrier and angrier. Finally, he grew so angry that he tried to jump the puddle himself, and in he fell with a great splash. When Shadow crawled out, wet and muddy, Peter had disappeared, and Shadow couldn't tell which path he had taken. Worse still, he didn't know which path to take to get out himself. He tried one after another, but after a little while he would find himself back at the puddle in the middle of the Old Briar-patch. Shadow the Weasel was lost. Yes, Sir, Shadow the Weasel was lost in the Old Briar-patch. Outside, Reddy Fox waited and watched, but no frightened Peter Rabbit came jumping out as he expected. What could it mean? After a long, long time, he saw someone very muddy and very wet and very tired crawl out of one of Peter Rabbit's little paths. It was Shadow the Weasel. Reddy took one look at him, and then he hurried away. He didn't want to hear what Shadow the Weasel would say. And as he hurried across the Green Meadows, he heard Peter Rabbit's voice from the middle of the Old Briar-patch. "If at first you don't succeed, try again," shouted Peter Rabbit. Reddy Fox ground his teeth. Chapter 12. The Plot of Two Scamps. Sammy Jay, looking around for mischief, found Reddy Fox sitting on his doorstep with his chin in both hands and looking as if he hadn't a friend in the world. "What are you doing?" asked Sammy Jay. "I'm just a-studying," replied Reddy Fox. "What are you studying? Maybe I can help you," said Sammy Jay. Reddy Fox heaved a long sigh. "I'm a-studying how I can catch Peter Rabbit," replied Reddy. Sammy Jay scratched his head thoughtfully. Reddy Fox still sat with his chin in his hands and thought and thought and thought. Sammy Jay sat on one foot and scratched and scratched and scratched his head with the other. Suddenly Sammy looked up. "I have it," said he. "You remember the hollow log over beyond the old hickory tree?" Reddy nodded his head. "Well, I'll go down and invite Peter Rabbit to come over there and see the strangest thing in the world. You know what great curiosity Peter Rabbit has. Now, you be hiding in the old hollow log, and when you hear me say to Peter Rabbit, 'The strangest thing in the world is waiting for you over there, Peter,' you spring out and you'll have Peter." Reddy Fox brightened up. This plan certainly did look good to Reddy. Peter had fooled him so many times that he was almost in despair. He knew that if he sent another invitation to Peter, Peter would suspect right away that it meant mischief. But Peter wouldn't think that Sammy Jay was planning mischief, because he knew that Sammy is the greatest news teller in the Green Forest. So Reddy Fox trotted off to the old hollow log down by the big hickory tree and crept inside. Sammy Jay flew over to the old briar patch to look for Peter. He found him sitting under a big bramble bush. "Good morning, Peter Rabbit," said Sammy Jay with his finest manner. Peter looked at Sammy sharply as he returned his greeting. Sammy Jay wasn't in the habit of being so polite to Peter, and Peter began to study just what it could mean. "I saw the strangest thing in the world this morning," said Sammy Jay. Peter pricked up his ears. In spite of himself, he began to grow curious. "What was it, Sammy Jay?" he asked. Sammy looked very mysterious. "I really don't know what it is," he replied. "But I can show it to you if you want to see for yourself, Peter Rabbit." Of course, Peter wanted to see it, so he started out across the Green Meadows with Sammy Jay. Now, the farther he went, the more time he had to think, and by the time he had nearly reached the old hickory tree, Peter began to suspect a trick. Sammy Jay motioned Peter to approach very carefully. "It's right over there in that hollow log, Peter," he whispered. "You go peep in and you'll see it." Then Sammy prepared to give the signal to Reddy Fox. Peter hopped a couple of steps nearer, and then he sat up very straight and gazed at the hollow log. Somehow he didn't just like the looks of it. He didn't know why, but he just didn't. Then along came one of Old Mother West Wind's merry little breezes, dancing right along past the hollow log and up to Peter Rabbit. And with him he brought a funny smell. Peter's little wobbly nose wrinkled. That funny smell certainly reminded Peter of Reddy Fox. He wrinkled his nose again. Then he suddenly whirled about. "Excuse me, Sammy Jay," he exclaimed. "I just remembered something very important." And before Sammy Jay could open his mouth, Peter had darted like a little brown streak for the old briar patch. End of section 4.